Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to the Philippines for a case that one of you sent us, Mendoza versus People. It's got it all. Cars, accusations of fraud, and a super important legal idea, probable cause. Maybe not the most exciting words, but stick with us. This is about, what actually gives someone the power to arrest you.
Yeah, and this case went all the way to the Supreme Court in the Philippines because of that very question, how does probable cause actually work?
Okay, so before we get into the legal stuff, can you set the scene? Who is this Alfredo Mendoza, and what exactly did he allegedly do?
So Mendoza worked for a company called Juno Cars Incorporated, and they accused him of stealing both money and cars. A lot of money, too. They claimed he skimmed close to 886,000 Philippine pesos from sales. And then on top of that, two cars disappeared while he was there, a 2001 Hyundai Starex and a Honda City.
Whoa, so they went all in with the accusations. What were the specific charges they brought against him?
Two main charges: qualified theft, meaning basically stealing something valuable, and estafa, which is a kind of fraud in Philippine law.
So I'm guessing Juno Cars took this to the police, and things started moving through the legal system.
Right. The case lands with the provincial prosecutor, and they're the ones who decide if there's enough evidence to officially charge someone. And in this case, the prosecutor looks at everything Juno Cars has presented and says, yep, we've got a case. So they file the formal charges against Mendoza.
Seems pretty straightforward so far, but I have a feeling this isn't the end of the story. What happened next?
Okay, here's where it gets interesting. The case goes to the trial court judge. The judge looks at all the evidence and then, boom, dismisses the charges completely. The judge basically says, there's not enough here to support these accusations, no need for a trial.
Wait a minute, so the prosecutor and the judge disagreed. How is that even possible?
That's what makes this case so important and why it ended up at the Supreme Court. It all comes down to probable cause. But there are actually two types of probable cause. See, the prosecutor decides on executive probable cause. That's just to get things started. Do they have enough to begin the legal process? But then a judge looks at it independently and decides on something called judicial probable cause.
Ah, okay, so it's not a one-person decision. There's a check in the system. The
Yeah.
judge is like a safeguard, making sure there's really enough evidence to move forward.
Exactly. And in this case, the judge was doing just that. Not just checking the prosecutor's work, but making their own judgment call.
I bet Juno Cars was not happy about that. Did they just give up?
Nope. They appealed the dismissal, and the case went up to the Court of Appeals.
So now we've got even more legal minds involved. What did the Court of Appeals have to say about all this?
Well, they actually started with Juno Cars. They reinstated the charges against Mendoza. It was like they were saying that the trial court judge had gone too far and that the prosecutor's initial decision should carry more weight.
So now it's a real debate about probable cause. The prosecutor says yes, the trial court judge says no, and the Court of Appeals jumps in and says, hold on, let's go back. Where'd it go from there?
Well, from the Court of Appeals, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the Philippines. And this is where things get really, really interesting.
Okay, so we've got this legal back and forth going on. What did the Supreme Court have to say? Who did they side with?
The Supreme Court sided with the trial court judge, and they dismissed the case against Mendoza. Their reasoning is actually super important for understanding all this.
All right, break it down for us. Why did the Supreme Court go with the judge?
Basically, they said that even though the prosecutor can start the charges based on the evidence they see, it's the judge who has the final word on whether there's enough to actually arrest someone and put them on trial. This judicial probable cause, they said it's a really important protection against, prosecutors maybe going too far.
Right, so you can't just get thrown in jail because a prosecutor thinks there might be something there. It has to be strong enough evidence that a judge also agrees with.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court even pointed to the Philippine Constitution, which specifically says you can't arrest someone unless a judge has looked at it independently and said, yep, there's probable cause.
So this wasn't just some legal technicality. It was about upholding a fundamental right that's in their constitution.
Absolutely. It was a big win for due process in the Philippines. The Supreme Court was saying that judges are independent and they have a crucial role in protecting people's rights.
This is what makes this case so fascinating, right? We're not just talking about stolen cars and some money. This goes way deeper to the principles of a fair justice system.
And what's wild is that the Supreme Court's decision in Mendoza versus People, it didn't just affect that one case. It had ripple effects throughout the entire Philippine legal system.
Oh, I bet. A ruling like that from their highest court must have had a huge impact. What were some of the consequences?
Well, for one thing, it really put judges in a new spotlight. Suddenly, their role in deciding probable cause became a lot more important?
Yeah, it makes sense. After this decision, judges will be thinking twice before just signing off on what a prosecutor said. They had to really look at the evidence themselves.
Exactly. They became more assertive, more willing to scrutinize what the prosecutors were bringing to them. They weren't afraid to say, nope, not enough here, and dismiss the charges if they thought the probable cause was weak.
And I bet it changed how prosecutors approach these cases too, right? Knowing a judge was going to be looking over their shoulder.
Oh, absolutely. Prosecutors had to be much more careful. They knew judges were going to be digging into their arguments, so they had to build really solid cases.
So it's like this one case raised the bar for everyone involved. Police had to do better investigations, prosecutors had to be more thorough, and judges had to be more careful about protecting those individual rights.
Exactly. It created a chain reaction of accountability throughout the system.
That's amazing. Just one case. But it led to this huge shift in how their legal system works. Did it have any impact outside the courtroom too? Like on regular people?
Yeah, definitely. This wasn't just some legal inside baseball. It had a real impact on public awareness.
How so? Did it change how people in the Philippines thought about the legal system?
I think so. The Mendoza case, because it was such a big deal and went all the way to the Supreme Court, it brought this idea of probable cause out into the open. People started to understand that they have a right to be protected from just being arrested for no reason. A judge has to look at it too.
So it's like this case actually empowered people, made them more aware of their rights and how the system is supposed to work to protect them.
Exactly. And that's a really important part of a healthy democracy, right? Having citizens who understand their rights and feel like they can actually hold the system accountable.
Okay, so we've talked about judges, prosecutors, the public. Did this case actually change any laws?
So Mendoza versus People didn't directly change any laws in the Philippines, but it did get a lot of people talking about some pretty important reforms.
What kind of reforms were they discussing?
Well, for one, a lot of experts started saying they needed clearer guidelines for what probable cause actually means, especially during that early stage of the investigation. Remember how the prosecutor and the judge in Mendoza's case, they totally disagreed?
Yeah, that seemed to be the heart of the problem.
Exactly. So some people were arguing that they needed specific rules about what evidence is actually needed to show probable cause right from the beginning. That way you wouldn't have these kinds of disagreements happening all the time.
It's like they wanted to set clear rules so everyone's on the same page, right?
Right. And there were also calls for more transparency in the prosecutor's office, like making sure their decisions are open to public scrutiny. That way they're more likely to be extra careful.
If they know someone's looking over their shoulder, they'll make sure they've got a strong case before they move forward.
It's all about checks and balances, making sure that the power is being used responsibly and fairly.
It's amazing how one case, even though it didn't change the law itself, can start these big discussions and make people push for reforms.
It shows you that laws aren't just words on a page. They're constantly evolving as they're used and interpreted and as people challenge the system. And sometimes those challenges can have a way bigger impact than you'd expect.
You know, we've been talking big picture here, legal stuff, system-wide impacts. But let's go back to the people for a minute. Remember, there's a person, Alfredo Mendoza, at the center of all this.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get lost in all the legal details, but this is a person whose life was turned upside down.
Even if he was found not guilty in the end, being accused of stealing and fraud, that can really damage your reputation, your relationships, everything. It's a lot to go through.
We can't forget that human story. Behind every case, behind all the arguments and the procedures, there are real people involved.
So as we're wrapping up our deep dive into Mendoza versus People, let's keep that in mind.
Agreed. This case shows that even though the law can be powerful and complex, it's really all about people. And every case, no matter how small, can affect people's lives in ways you might not expect.
This has been such a fascinating journey through the Philippine legal system.
Yeah.
We saw how one case, one question about probable cause, can reveal these deep legal principles and have a huge ripple effect. It really shows you how the law, even though it can seem like this, I don't know, like this big abstract thing, it really does have a direct impact on people's lives.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about Mendoza versus People is It's not like it was based on some brand new legal idea. It was really about how they applied existing laws, and how they interpreted these longstanding rights in the Philippine Constitution. But because of how they applied it in this case, it really did lead to some pretty big changes.
It's like it exposed, like a
Yeah.
weak point,
Yeah.
like a pressure point in the system.
Yeah.
And by bringing it out in the open, like making everyone look at it, it actually ended up making the whole system stronger, more fair.
You said that perfectly. And I think to wrap things up, we should leave our listener with one more question, something to really think about. We talked about how much power the judge has in these cases, deciding on probable cause, and Supreme Court really made it clear that's a super important protection for people's rights. But then it makes you wonder, what if you were the judge?
Ooh, that's a good point. Remember, our listeners send us all the court documents,
Yes.
right? So they've seen the same evidence that the judge was looking at.
Exactly. So, dear listener, put yourself in the judge's shoes for a second. You've got Juno Carr saying he did it, you've got Mendoza saying he didn't, and you've got the prosecutor saying, let's go to trial. What would you have decided, and why?
It really gets to the core of what justice means.
Right. Yeah.
Like, how do you balance the evidence, the rights of the person being accused, and the need to, actually hold people accountable when they do something wrong? It's not an easy question.
And that's what makes law so fascinating. It's full of these tough questions that make you really stop and think, and really try to understand what's at stake.
We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive and maybe learned something new along the way. It's a reminder that even a case about, stolen cars, it can uncover all these fascinating legal issues, and the ripple effects can be huge.
Yeah, and if this got you thinking about the law, there are so many other interesting cases out there, just waiting to be discovered.
Keep that curiosity going. Sometimes the best stories are hidden away in those court documents. Until next time.